Okay, so the drawing's been finalised, the client is happy.
Shut the up. To be honest, I'm getting so sick of speaking in these videos and having no idea how to make an engaging video. So sick of it, to be honest, that this isn't even my real voice. I've cloned it in an AI program and I'm actually typing out the words that you're hearing. So for this video, I'm taking a different approach. I'm going to try and do a hybrid video to show a combination of what I'm doing in terms of the wine boxes that I'm making in the video, what I was thinking at the time of recording, as well as some unfiltered commentary about what's really going on behind the scenes during this entire project. Starting with this first scene, you might be wondering why the framing and audio was so bad at the start of this video. Well, that's because despite owning a $2,000 camera and microphone like an idiot, I forgot to take it to the factory this night and had to film on my phone. When stuff like this happens, I tend to dwell on it and it causes further frustrations to my build projects. However, I'm slowly getting better at letting things like this slide. Anyhow, moving on, the first part of this build was to inspect the material that the client had sent me. Actually, just back that up for a second. If you were wondering why this footage is so dull, this is what it looks like before it's color graded. I've never been happy with the quality of my videos, but I'm aiming to improve them little by little as I learn new skills like this. Now back to the build. I originally said yes to this request because I thought I had 9 months to make the boxes. However, the material arrived just 6 weeks before deadline. Not only that, I was only sent the exact amount of material required for the 2 boxes, so there was zero room for error. So what I'm doing here is optimizing all of the parts required to see how they can be arranged on the links provided. If the parts weren't assigned properly, there wouldn't be enough yield in the timber. You'd think this shouldn't take so long, and it really shouldn't. But if you hadn't noticed by the state of my hair and bags under my eyes, I was pretty tired as the majority of this build was completed between 8 and 11 PM each night. Once the material was checked, I dribbled on into the camera again about all things optimization because I don't really know what else to do in build videos. But this becomes about as entertaining for the viewer as watching paint dry or watching timber pass through a jointer and thicknesser. That just happens to be the next step in the process though. I think woodworkers like to show this process for no other reason than it can become a time-consuming and laborious task, and they just want everyone to know how hard they work and how much work goes into making something from scratch. I get it, but let's move on. I will quickly add though that because I had to work to very tight tolerances, I did have to dress this material to very precise measurements. For anyone interested, the material being used here was a combination of Tasmanian Blackwood and Tasmanian oak. I won't bore you with the details of docking the parts to length on the drop saw. More honestly, I just actually forgot to film that step. But we're back home now in my home workshop that is quickly becoming the land of broken dreams. If you're new here, a few years ago, I quit my job to do woodwork and design full time. It didn't exactly go to plan, but not necessarily in a bad way. I ended up course correcting and joining forces with a cabinet maker mate of mine, who has helped me set up a manufacturing company. The only thing is, it's going that well that I don't have much time to do woodwork specific bespoke projects, so I'm not really complaining, but that's one reason you haven't seen much woodwork from me in the last year or so. Now before I go on any further, firstly, what the f is this music? Just another frustration of this video making business is that I never know what background music and sound effects to use. But worse than this is the frustrations of technology at times. I'm just going to break the fourth wall here for a second. And yes, this is a reenactment. I'm not a weirdo that films himself editing all night. But now that I've had a few minutes to calm down, I'll just say that I've been video editing all night and have just lost about 4 hours of work. This is a reason I like to watch small woodwork channels. I know the effort that goes in and the shit that happens behind the scenes, especially when you can't afford a videographer or editor and you have to do everything yourself. So if you're a small channel watching this, drop your channel in the comments and I'll check out your page. And if you've enjoyed this video so far, I'll be very grateful if you'd like to drop me a follow and maybe share this video with a friend. All right, back to the wine boxes. I initially had every intention of making these wine boxes completely with hand tools, but as I mentioned, I only had 6 weeks to make them instead of the 9 months I thought I had. So in this next step, I marked out the through tenons for the ends of the boxes. I would usually use a marking knife for accuracy here, but all I really needed was to indicate the waste areas to get somewhere close, as I ended up making a trimmer jig to cut these out. Yeah, I know, what a cheat. Because I was only going to use a little battery powered trimmer, I first removed the majority of the waste from the joints, to make it easier on the blade. This Tasmanian Blackwood was actually a lot more dense than I thought it would be. You might notice that the footage in this video is quite dark. That is because the majority of this project took place well into the nights. And I don't want to carry on like some kind of hero about how hard or late I work, but as I said earlier, I want to do this video a little differently and give some more introspection from behind the scenes. At the time of this filming, my company was struggling to get off the ground. So turning down any work coming my way seemed stupid, so I said yes to everything. And one thing I promised myself when I started out with this company is that I would not let it impede on my ability to spend time with my children. So the only time I could work on this particular project was at night when they were asleep upstairs. This of course created a few issues. One is the lighting. I had to buy myself a semi-decent continuous LED studio light to be able to film in the workshop at night. The LED downlights in the ceiling wreak havoc on film quality. Not that I'm any professional, but the new lighting does work way better. The next issue is sleep deprivation. Like even this first step, you can see how much wobble was in my bench that weighs over 200 kilos. It took me way too long to realise I hadn't kicked down the caster wheel locks, so it was moving around a lot. It's little things like this that I've tried to improve for both my safety, sanity and quality. Once the waste material from the through tenons was removed roughly, I whipped up a jig on the fly to use with my little trimmer. I just used a straight cut bit, set to the desired depth, and used the jig as a shoulder line to run the trimmer up against. I then ran the trimmer over as a test and hoped that all was going to work out well. And once the jig was removed and the first test was a success, I just repeated this process 1 million times until all of the tenons were completed. So you can see here I'm sawing really fast, and I'm doing this due to the perceived attention span of the viewer. I'm not sure what people like to see most. Do you guys like cutscenes, time lapses, or sped up footage? It's a guessing game for me. I'm always stuck between a rock and a hard place between wanting to show the entire process, but also not bore the hell out of people watching. Anyhow, it's cool with me if you want to tune out. I mean, it would be great if you stuck around and watched, but because I know the next couple of seconds took me hours, I'm going to put all the footage in anyway, but speed it up. Because if nothing else, I would maybe like to rewatch this video sometime later in life to remember what kind of effort went into the build. So other than the project build itself, I'm actually trying to learn a few new things here. I was experimenting with different camera angles and positioning of the light source. Again, I'm not suggesting everything turned out perfect, but I do think that I'm slowly learning, and the footage I take should start slowly improving over time. Ooh, did you see that little zoom in there? I still don't really know what to do in these videos in terms of transitions, shot sequences and effects, so I tend to just do stuff like this over and over. Again, I digress. To take the material out of the middle section of the tenons, I had to employ a coping saw to get rid of the bulk of the material, then make a slight adjustment to my jig. Then I was able to trim away these sections also. Strap yourselves in. Here comes another heap of sped up footage. And that is the ends done. Ah, bloody hell, music clip has finished. I hate trying to guess what will work best with what scenes. If you have any tips, drop a comment in the comment section. For now, I will go find something. Just give me a second. I use a paid service for royalty-free music because it's just easier, but unfortunately still another cost I don't really have the money to be paying for. But in case you were wondering, that's where I get it. So let's see. Something here in the background beat section will do for now. Let's just go with this one. What I'm doing here is marking out face sides and face edges for future reference, as well as lettering or numbering each corner. So I know that when I come back to this another day, I will know that corner A goes with corner A, corner B with B, and corner C with C, etc. because I'm pretty sure after I mark these out, I crashed for the night. The next crack I had at progress was the following night. I used the handles of the boxes as a spacer to mark out the holes of the through, mortise and tenon joints. This gave me the distance I needed to be in from each end of the sides. Then I used the ends themselves to gauge the thickness of the joints. After that, I squared everything off and used the tails of the ends to mark the final position of the holes. Repeating this process on the ends of each of the 8 sides. Here's another little learning point here. I found after I filmed this video that a lot of the footage kept going in and out of focus, and trust me, I wasn't going for any artistic effect here. It is simply just bad camera work. For anyone wanting to know how to fix this on a DSLR camera, what you need to find out is if your camera has multiple autofocus settings. I am using a Panasonic Lumix GH6 camera, and there is a dial on the back that has 3 options: MF, C and S. MF stands for manual focus, C stands for continuous autofocus, and S stands for single autofocus. Unbeknownst to me, I had the camera set on continuous autofocus for most of the filming, so anytime something entered the frame, the camera would try and refocus. Because I was also filming in low artificial light, and the camera not being all that expensive, this wasn't ideal as the camera struggled to focus quickly or stay focused where I wanted it to. I really should have been using the single autofocus function or manual function. But again, not a professional. I will continue to learn from these mistakes. So yeah, a fair bit of this footage was pretty rubbish, but I think you get the idea of what I was doing. Once the square holes for the tenons were marked out, it was time to remove the waste. I decided to use a Forstner bit to clear out the majority of the waste before chiseling out the square edges. Even though I did a pretty good job of the soundproofing of my workshop, it was a bit risky to use the drill press at night directly under our bedroom whilst my wife was upstairs sleeping, so I tried to pump out most of the drilling directly after work before the kids got home from school. Not sure if you just heard that dog bark in the background, but this is also a factor that affects the recording of these videos. I have 2 ridgebacks that love to go at it just outside the workshop, which is just fantastic when trying to record voiceovers. Hence another reason for going with this AI voiceover instead. Squaring out these holes was far harder than I assumed. This Blackwood was particularly dense, and even with a freshly sharpened chisel, I was struggling to remove the remaining material efficiently. The face material was threatening to split, so I tried removing even more of the material with a coping saw before returning with the chisel, which didn't particularly help things out that much either. By this stage, I was more than questioning my life's choices, as this project timeline had blown out beyond the point of any kind of profit margin. And again, because I was struggling to make any kind of money at the time, this project started becoming more of a chore than anything else. I even added some water into the equation to try and soften the timber fibers, which did work a little bit. But all in all, each hole took about 15 minutes to half an hour to complete. So given that each side had 4 holes and there were 2 boxes being made, this entire chiseling process took me between 2 to 4 hours. Which was obviously less than ideal, but shit happens, and I'd agreed to the work, so it had to be done. So back to the ends. I gave the ends a quick hit with some sandpaper. I wouldn't advise using this yellow crap on nice timber like this, but it was the only sandpaper I had. I ended up needing to hit these parts with the air compressor to get rid of the yellow residue. I'd advise using a garnet paper instead of whatever this silica looking paint removal paper is. Next up, I had to mark out the chamfers for the through mortise pins. With the amount of winding I've done so far, you'd think this arduous task would have caused me more frustration, but this was actually the most enjoyable part of the build. I marked out the chamfers with my little fancy Japanese marking gauge, then went to work, paring them away with a nice sharp chisel. Oh, hold on, haven't finished with the marking gauge yet. Let's have a quick look at this first, hey? Yes, time. Did I mention I grossly underestimated the time I allocated to this project? So here we are at my favourite section of the build. Again, I still hadn't fixed the kickdown wheel situation or the focus issue on my camera, so a lot of the footage for this section was pretty useless. But at the very least, I enjoyed the nature of the task. Paring the timber away with a Japanese chisel was a very relaxing process. It allowed my brain to switch off for a while and let the ever-growing stresses of life subside for a few hours. Although the footage wasn't great, I was happy with the end result. Next up, I just did a quick dry assembly to check that the through mortise and tenons fit. I was panicking a bit because I was up the creek without a paddle if they didn't. By the way, I'm just randomly experimenting with these superimposed CAD models here. I can't quite get the animations right, but this video has already taken me far too long to make, so it is what it is for now. Anyway, the joints fit fine, so let's move on. Here are all the parts again. I filmed this for B-roll, so here we go. Here's some B-roll that won't end up being used anywhere else. I'm not extremely proud of this next step, and I was going to leave it out of the footage altogether, and pretend I didn't do it. But I employed a biscuit jointer here to secure the bottom of the boxes in place. Yes, I'm disgusted in myself too. Next we have the glue up of the main body of the boxes. This involved a little bit of mucking around, so again, I'll speed this up. I've also just noticed the Adobe timeline has just passed the 15-minute mark, and I should probably split this video into a second episode. I get so much unsolicited advice on what I need to do to make my videos get higher engagement, make them longer, make them shorter, add music, remove music, put in subtitles, remove all text, do voiceovers, don't do voiceovers. To be honest, I don't really care anymore. If I keep focusing on trying to impress other people, I'll stop enjoying what I'm doing. So I'm just going to keep pushing through with this video as a single episode. The likelihood of me ever getting monetized is so close to zero anyhow. So I'm just going to keep editing the way I like and the way my kids find entertaining. And if anyone else happens to enjoy it, that will be a bonus. Talking about bonuses, it is a massive bonus that I have a laser cutter. Every time I look at my laser, it reminds me of yet another failed business venture. I tried establishing a laser engraving business, but after a year of failing to gain any momentum, it basically imploded on itself. However, the upside is the laser comes in real handy to make quick trimmer tracing jigs, both for hobby projects and in the cabinet factory when we need templates made fast. In this specific case, I use the laser to cut out some sticky back acrylic templates to route out the handles for the wine boxes with the top bearing tracer bit. To start with, I just completed a tiny kiss cut on the exit end to avoid tear out, then routed from left to right the rest of the way to complete an arc pattern, achieving the curved shape of the handles. If you're new to woodworking, the way this works is that a tracer bit consists of a flat blade that is flush with a bearing above the blade. You set the depth of the bit so that the bearing hits against your template and the blade hits against your material. As you work your way across, the bearing traces the template and the spinning blade removes the material below. Because the handles were a little small and fiddly, I mapped them all out on one length of timber so that they were easier to handle and clamp down whilst using the trimmer. Once all the curves were created, I then needed to run a chamfer along the inside edge to allow a little bit better ergonomics when lifting the boxes by the handles. So similarly to the tracer bit, I used a chamfer bit with a tracing bearing on it. However, this time, the actual curves themselves acted as the template, as I was only shaving off half of the thickness of the material on a 45-degree angle. So I had the other half of the thickness of the material for the bearing to run along. Well, it appears yet again, I forgot to film a few steps, but not to worry, it wasn't the most enthralling part of the build. I simply just ripped some end stops on the table saw after work, docked them on the drop saw, and then glued them onto the end of the boxes. Oh yeah, it also looks like I may have done some sanding as well before these handles went on. I do recall toward the end of this project, I was in two minds about continuing to film and make a video about the build at all. I was running out of time and preparing the tripod, camera, battery, cards and lights all the time. Does add significant time to the schedule of a project, so the recording from this point on was haphazard at best. So nothing fancy here, I just straight up glued the handles in which were cut and shaped with pretty decent accuracy, if I do say so myself. This is the part, if anyone gets this far through the video, where best case scenario, they might feel the need to type a backhanded comment like, yeah, it's okay, but not as good as so-and-so, you should see their work, or a couch warrior suggesting they could do it better, and so on. You gotta be pretty game to appreciate your own work in front of anyone these days, but nonetheless, I was more than happy with the quality of this project, and if you can't find happiness in doing this, or be proud of the work you produce, what is the point in doing it at all if you care about what other people think? Now onto a little cleanup. I'm using a low angle jack plane here and just feeling out the grain direction to start with. Just double checking I can work my way around to flatten these ends and get everything all flushed away. So the plan here was to attack the end grain of the sides on an angle that would compress the end grain and not blow out. Then I'd complete a sweeping action to hit the handles at an angle that would allow the blade to work with and along the grain, before sweeping back into the end grain of the sides. And if I were aware enough to remember to hit the record button, I would have been able to show you that I came back along the end grain from the opposite direction, but it appears I have no further footage of this planing process. So onto the end stops. I had to plane a lot of end grain, which is a pain in the ass, especially across narrow surfaces. So here's a few things I did to mitigate the risk of blowout. Number one, I sharpened the hell out of the blade, or iron if you will. Number two, I used a low angle plane. And number three, I used more of a shearing action than a plain stroke. This allowed me to sever across the fibres where I could, much like a horizontal guillotine. By keeping the blade compressing into the material and shearing in an arc meant that there was very little occasion where the blade ever completely pushed material out and away from the workpiece. For the majority of the time, the material was being compressed back in on itself and the blade took care of the rest. Alright, so where are we up to? Yep, the lid. I'm going to have to recognise that I have no idea if this video has any continuity or flow that makes sense. The time I have to edit is minimal, so sometimes each 60 seconds of final footage could have been completed days or weeks apart. So for this I apologise, I'm doing my best, but back to the lid. There was a fair bit of f***ing around if I can remember rightly. I've never made one of these Japanese influence boxes before, so I was shooting from the hip when it came to the placement of the lid stop and support blocks. The lid actually slides under the stops that are secured to the box, and a dual angled wedge is used to pull the lid up to hold it in place. There are a few variables to consider here, as there had to be enough room for the lid to slide in under the stops, but also enough of the lid left to grab purchase on the underside of the stop once the wedge was pushed in. I basically just cut everything oversized and did multiple dry assemblies and modifications to both the lid length and stop placements until everything lined up like it should. And how did I get the shape of the stops and pegs? Well, here I am using an upside down hand plane as a manually operated jointer, and I was pretty happy how they turned out, but I didn't film how I got the basic shape for these parts because, to be honest, I didn't want to have any proof of how dangerous it was if things went sideways, nor did I want anyone trying to emulate the process. Again, as I was running out of time, how I actually cut these wedges to the rough shape was on a drop saw. I set the angle of the drop saw to 22.5 degrees on the flat and also 22.5 degrees on the vertical. I cut along the grain using those two angles simultaneously. Then I set the saw back square and docked, or I should technically say, ripped them square. They turned out fine, but I wouldn't recommend using a drop saw along the grain like I did. It was a bit sketchy at best. I probably wouldn't recommend using a plane like this either, but at the time, I couldn't figure out how to clamp these small pegs in a way that I could easily plane them on the angle. So it seemed like a good idea at the time. However, watching this footage back, I can see my fingers are probably a little close to that razor sharp blade. It was very effective though to get a nice finished surface without risking rounding over any edges with sandpaper. So I'm probably going a bit back and forth here, but the end stops and lid pegs, or whatever they're called, were just glued on. Nothing fancy, and once set, I tested the lid assembly, then planed down the ends and pegs in situ until the top faces were flush, flat and level. One thing I'll point out here, if anyone wants to learn anything a bit technical, during the preparation of these parts there was deliberate and specific planning out of the grain direction of each of these parts of timber, because I had planned to plane these parts down in situ to get the most accurate desired result. I made sure each part's grain was running in the same direction so that I could complete this step without tear out. Obviously, using a low angle jack plane also helped to achieve a smooth result. Once the top surfaces were planed flat and I was happy, I moved on to marking out a chamfer on the majority of the edges of the top assembly and got to work planing and paring these chamfers down to add a bit of character. I've been told some viewers like the ASMR sounds of these actions, so I'll mute the music here and let you enjoy a little bit of the uninterrupted sounds of woodworking. You know what, I changed my mind. Even after editing, there's about 6 minutes of this. I'll chuck that section in a separate video for the patient ones, and you can check that out on my YouTube channel if that floats your boat. It'll probably be up before this one goes live. So let's speed through the rest of this planing and pairing footage to bring us home with applying a finish. To finish off the boxes, I decided to use Osmo Top Oil. I'm not going to spend any time justifying this finish. I just used it because I believe it will be a solid finish. For a wine box, it is food safe once completely cured and brings out and enhances the natural colours of the timber, not to mention that it can be applied with an oil rag and buffed up with a clean rag. I'm not sure how much more you'd like to see of this. I think it's the glory hog part of any build where all of the other tasks have played their part. Then the finish comes in and takes all the glory. I'll have a flick through and see if I filmed any good shots. I'm literally thinking about just cutting this video and end it right now and go to bed, as I have to take my son to footy in the morning and my daughter has just had her tonsils out, so no one here is sleeping. But I set a goal to finish editing this video tonight and put as much detail into it so that I can watch this back in a few years and remember the process in a little more vivid detail. So hang in there, I'll see what we've got here. Well, turns out the only footage I had of the second coat was this terrible overhead shot. Remember, I was still learning how to film at this stage, but here is a little bit of footage of the boxes after the second coat. So here I tried some different light settings to try and capture the boxes in some complementary lighting. And once the top oils cured, they were ready for the customer with 2 days to spare. But of course, the project isn't finished these days until you've tried to capture some photographic masterpiece of the final product to share on social media, even though you are not a photographer. I don't have a studio or an area I can really set anything professional up to take a decent photo. So I'll let you in on a little secret about the photos I put up on Instagram of the final boxes. These photos were actually just taken on a sheet of Blackwood on the front of our forklift at the factory, and I used the forks to adjust the height of the boxes to get what I considered the best lighting. So no doubt there'll be people complaining that this video dragged out too long, but I've had a number of friends that have told me I don't show enough detail of the finished projects in my build videos, so I decided to leave this last section run a little longer just for them. They've been watching this channel from the beginning, so as long as they are pleased to see more of the finished product, I'm not too concerned about what the algorithm and other people think. At the end of the day, I have no interest in tricking people into watching these videos. If you watch them, you watch them. If you don't, you don't. I guess I'll just keep doing them the way I like to do them, and hopefully they keep getting better over time. And if more people start enjoying them, then that will just be a bonus. The end. Just like that. No credits, no outtakes. I'm tired. I'm going to bed. Thanks for watching. I actually really do appreciate it.